Elrigu namaskara. Good evening. I won't try and speak to you on digital personal data protection in Kannada. Adu beda. I'll confuse you, confuse me, and the whole objective of the Sansad Dhwani will be defeated. So I will speak in English on the subject. First of all, thank you to my colleague in Parliament and our representative in Parliament, my representative in Parliament as well, Tejasvi Suryaji. Shri Sharad Sharma, who's also already given you his views. And to all of you, good evening. Just a small correction to the MC. The bill is already notified, so the bill is not in Lok Sabha alone. It is Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha, the President of India, and it has been gazetted today, so it is law. The Digital Personal Data Protection Bill is law as of today. And let me share some of my thoughts on the bill and, of course, the context in which that bill is important. First of all, I have been here before. I have spoken to, I don't know how many of you in this audience have already met with me and spoken to me, but certainly you remember that to those who have met me, you remember I was here a few months ago and I laid out Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji's vision of this new India which is being built around young Indians such as yourself and more opportunities for young Indians. He coined a phrase on 15th of August 2021 called India Techade. India Techade to you should mean a lot because it's really, he is envisioning a decade full of technology opportunities for those who are students today, who will be in the workforce tomorrow, who will be entrepreneurs tomorrow. The India Techade is an exciting vision, and therefore I always, when I meet students in colleges, I say, simply with a little bit of envy on my part, and on behalf of all grey-haired people of the world, that you are certainly the luckiest generation in the history of independent India because of how exciting the present and how exciting the future looks for you. That is being built out by policies, the hard work, determination of our Prime Minister, who, amongst other things, is the biggest believer in the potential and the capabilities of the youth of India. What is digital privacy? What is digital personal data protection? Another law. I mean, you saw in the last 2 weeks plenty of disruptions, and you must have scratched your heads if you were watching TV and saying, what is the point of these people in Delhi and what good will come out of them in Parliament? But I can certainly tell you that this bill is certainly one of the goods that has come out of Parliament despite the disruptions. And so what is the history of this privacy? Where does this conversation start? Why is this bill so important? Some facts have been laid out by Mr. Sharma. But I will give you, certainly as somebody who's been a traveler on pretty much that entire journey, I will certainly want to share with you that background and then I'll get into the bill. In 2010, I was a member of Parliament. I was certainly not in the government, and it was the UPA Congress government at that time. I introduced in Parliament a private member's bill asking for privacy to be declared a fundamental right. The government of the day, of those days, felt that that was not necessary. They ignored any call for debate in Parliament and they continued business as usual. And essentially personal data of Indians were flying all around the country. It was available, and I remember once in Parliament raising a sheaf of personal data which I had bought in Palika Bazaar of Connaught Place for 50 rupees, which gave me name, address, telephone number, date of birth, everything. And that was just floating around as if that meant nothing to the people whose data it was. So in 2013, a group of us in Bengaluru, and this is why it's important that you in the audience as Bengaloreans understand that in a lot of ways this bill, the genesis of this bill was in Bengaluru. So Justice Puttaswamy, there was a Colonel Matthew, and myself, as petitioners, filed a PIL in the Supreme Court. And the journey from 2013 to 2017 resulted on the 24th of August 2017. And by that time, Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji was already Prime Minister. People had voted him in. And in 2017, the Supreme Court found that privacy is a fundamental right. Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji got his team to swing into action to codify that into a legislation. And the first draft of that legislation came about in mid-2019 after a series of committees, including the Justice Sri Krishna Committee report, had been sought for and asked and submitted. So 2019, the draft bill was tabled in Parliament. That was referred to a joint committee of Parliament in which Tejasvi also was a member. I was also a member. And that, unfortunately, during COVID, took about 1.5 to 2 years for a report to come out. But what came out on the other end of that discussion was a very complex, highly complex bill that would have certainly protected citizens' rights, but would have put a brake on innovation, would have slowed down innovation, created compliance burdens for our young startups. And so the Prime Minister agreed to our request that we withdraw that bill and go back to the drawing board. And that happened on the 22nd of October 2022. And then we have the bill as was passed in Parliament, Lok Sabha, Raj Sabha, and then notified by the government. So I just wanted to give you this journey of almost 10 years where this issue of privacy started being debated. And finally, we now have a world-class legislation. Why is a world-class legislation so important? And I will go back to the first point that I made, that the next 5-7 years represents so much technology and innovation opportunity for India and Indians and young Indians and startups that is almost certainly requires an enabling framework of law that permits this, catalyzes this, and accelerates this, rather than impedes it or breaks it. Which is why the Honorable Prime Minister said we need new laws, modern laws, which are designed, developed with the participation of our young Indians, entrepreneurs and startups, so that these bills, these laws work for them. These laws are not meant to satisfy some MPs or some large businesses. These laws are being framed by our government, by Parliament, so that for all those of you who are going to be entrepreneurs in the short term, in the long term, in the future, these legislations, and you must have noticed that I've used the word plural in legislations, and I'll explain why I use the plural. Like DPDP, enable that future, enable that India Techade, enable the $1 trillion digital economy goal that we have. That is the background. Now, what is privacy and why is privacy so important? One of the defining features of the last decade of digitization in the world, whether it is social media, whether it is this platform, that platform, has been the almost unfettered, at least in the Indian context, unimpeded, without consequence use of personal data by platforms. And those platforms could use your personal data not just to deliver your service or deliver your product, but then to do all kinds of other things, including causing harm. Intended, unintended. intentional, unintentional, witting, unwitting. This behavior, this bad behavior, this exploitation, this misuse of personal data is an open secret. I think all of you know, you get calls from people, you go to a website, you log in and you order something, and suddenly 2 days later you have something else being thrown at you. So the misuse and exploitation of citizens' personal data is something that many platforms have been doing. And of course, they will argue it is in your interest and it's great and it's very good and it's not causing harm. But it's certainly, in many, many cases, causing harm and certainly violating the Supreme Court's finding that privacy is a fundamental right. So for this bill, just to describe what this bill achieves. First of all, it puts a brake on the practice, brake as in B-R-A-K-E, brake, on the practice of misuse and exploitation of personal data without consent. So if you are one of you, no platform can now use your personal data without you saying, yes, I agree. And for them to get that yes, they have to ask you the question in a meaningful, informed manner. And this is at the heart of this Digital Personal Data Protection Bill. And this is absolutely consistent and in line with our Prime Minister's vision, philosophy, that citizens' rights, as we talk about innovation, as we talk about real estate, everywhere, he says, at the heart of every public policy, we must enshrine what the rights of our citizens are. So that is why about a few years ago, you remember there was a bill called RERA, the Real Estate Regulation Act, that dealt with the asymmetry between home builders and those who are buying homes. And that has, in a lot of ways, dealt with that asymmetry and created an equal culture of accountability and rights for the citizens who buy. Same way here, the DPDP at its heart creates these rights for all of you, every citizen of India. And without your consent, no platform, neither government nor private, can access your personal data. So that is point number one. Point number two is about data minimization. Assume for a minute I'm a platform, I'm delivering food. I certainly have no business asking you what your grandfather is, who your grandmother is, where is your ancestral home, what is your blood group. I should ask you for your credit card number and ask you for the delivery address. So data minimization says any platform that asks you for data to deliver a product or a service that you want should only ask for the minimum amount of data that is required to deliver that service. Third, purpose limitation. This is very important. A platform that takes your personal data can only use it for the purpose that you have consented to. So in the consent, if you say, I give Mr. Zomato my home address and my credit card number, I certainly don't give that food delivery platform my consent to use my details for anything other than delivering my food. That is purpose limitation. And the third is storage limitation, which is that you cannot store the data, my data, your data, personal data, for any longer than that is required to deliver the service. So the question of creating big databases of personal data that have been collected to deliver a service and then to use that for something also stops. These are the 3 or 4 basic principles that have gone into the DPDP that at the heart of it go to creating or codifying the rights of every Indian citizen that deal with platforms that have to use their personal data. On the other hand, reciprocally, the obligations of platforms have been defined in a manner that are so simple and easy to read and understand that even the smallest of startups to the biggest of big tech companies from around the world will find it easy to understand and comply with without having to worry about hundreds of lawyers. And it may certainly, one of the arguments of the DPDP is that it will put lawyers out of business, which is not a bad thing, I believe, anyway. But certainly this is not something that has a huge compliance overhead or complexity. And so we expect two things to happen after the bill is promulgated and notified and is operationalized, and we'll certainly have a transition period because it's moving to a new regime. So we will give industry, we will give companies time to transition to this new regime. But the consequences, like I said, is that era of misuse, the era of exploitation, the era of platforms believing that Indian citizens did not have rights and their personal data can be used and exploited in multiple ways comes to an end with this bill. But this bill is a very important marker for the catalyzing the innovation ecosystem, because it removes any ambiguity about what a startup or what a company is supposed to do when privacy has been declared a fundamental right. Earlier, there were all types of formulations. People were worried, is this violating, is this compliant, is it harmonized? Now there is none of that. It's an absolutely simple, clear, transparent framework for companies and for citizens. And whenever there is a dispute, for argument's sake, some company breaches its data or breaches its obligations, all the citizen has to do, it doesn't have to run around from place to place, go to a website, send out the details of the breach to the Data Protection Board, and the Data Protection Board will start the investigation of the breach and levy penalties on the breaching platform that could be as high as 250 crores per breach. Now, again, I want to explain to you when people say, and you will read a lot of editorials, oh, this happened, that happened, and all that. The idea of the government is not to make money by incentivizing companies to breach data. I certainly want to clarify that. We wanted to make the penalties so punitive that there is an incentive for platforms to behave themselves in a responsible manner vis-a-vis Indian citizens. So the penalties are not any way for the government to make money or for anybody to make money, but they are there to ensure that platforms understand that the government of India takes the duty to protect the rights of our Indian citizens very seriously, and that any erring platform will have to pay significant financial consequences. And just to give you an idea of what the financial consequence could be, in a worst case scenario, let us say a database with 10,000 entries is breached, and there are 10,000 entries that have been breached, the financial penalty could be as high as 10,000 times 250 crores. That's a lot of zeros. That's more zeros than A. Raja and the 2G scam. So that's a lot of zeros. So I've explained the GDPR, the DPDP. I certainly, you're all young, smart minds, would request you to read it. They're all available online. Very simple English. The ladies will, in the audience, will like it because the gender of the bill is that of a woman. So it is almost that the bill refers to every Indian as a female gender, and so that is also a first in terms of legislation and bills in this space. So please do read it, and please be aware of the rights. Please, amongst your own friends, make it known to others what this is about, and you're all more digital than all of us. So you are now getting into this digital world with a lot more safeguard and guardrails that were not there in the past. I certainly want to make a couple of other points before I wind up. One is about this debate on GDPR. And there has been a fashion in this country, and you know that there are many people who think anything foreign is automatically the best. And so there has been a history that every privacy and data protection conversation in India almost starts with a conversation on GDPR. And GDPR, by the way, is the European Data Protection Act. And one of the things we decided when we started designing this bill is that we will design this bill ground up from an Indian bill, as an Indian bill. And so we have made no efforts and attempts to even pretend that this is similar to GDPR or it is derived from or inspired from GDPR. We have looked at the Indian internet with 830 million Indians today who use the internet. By 25-26, that will be 1.2 billion Indians. We are the largest connected country in the world. We are the largest single group on the global internet. And so I think you will agree with me that we deserve to be setting the standards and the basis for any conversation about technology for the future rather than borrow anything from Europe or the US going forward. So therefore, this bill, if anybody comes to you and says, no, but it's not like GDPR, it's, all that will happen. Say, no, this is the Indian Digital Personal Data Protection Bill. And that's it. And I'll give you one little experience I had. I was in Dubai in a conversation like this with the digital minister of Dubai, Abu Dhabi, or UAE. And a lady journalist, foreign journalist, stood up and said, but your Indian bill doesn't look like the GDPR. And so I was prepared to go give my long response to that. But my friend and colleague from the United Arab Emirates said, and I think he said it beautifully, he said, look, India is leading the world, and now it's time for the world to follow what India is doing in terms of rules and regulations. So that is where we are as a country. We have the confidence. You represent the future energy that we have in terms of what we will do in the tech space. I will just end by saying one more thing. That is that the companion bill to this, that you will soon hear about in this month itself, is something called the Digital India Act. And that is why I was using plural in the legislations. The Digital India Act will replace the IT Act, which is a 22-year-old legislation. The Digital India Act will go into consultations very soon. The pre-consultation for that act was done in 4 locations, including one in Bangalore. And that went off very well. And the Digital India Act will deal with the whole ecosystem of tech. The Digital Personal Data Protection Bill deals with a very narrow slice which relates to regulation and rights of consumers and obligations of platforms relating to personal data. But the entire other world, including that of emerging technologies, etc., will be dealt with the Digital India Act. So I just want you to be ready to be engaged on that as well. Thank you for your time. I hope this has been useful for you. Certainly always a useful thing for me to engage with all of you, especially students. Thank you. Jai Hind.